Thanks very much, Ollie, and thank you, of course, to Weatherbys and to Mike for the invitation to come and speak to you today. I've called my talk Running with the New Narrative, and I'll explain why I did that in a moment. So this is me, and this is a friend of mine who's an astronomer, and we're looking at a star. It's actually not a star. Does anyone know what it is that we're looking at in the sky? I knew you guys would get it. Almost nobody does, but I knew you guys would. That is the planet Venus. I have this friend who's an astronomer. He often persuades me to go out in the early hours of the morning and look at beautiful things, and luckily they are beautiful, which is why we're still friends. And this is something about Venus that I'm going to start with. So this is the planet Earth, our beautiful blue planet. This is the planet Venus. Really interesting planet. It's actually more or less our twin. Now, you didn't expect me to start to talk about climate change on Venus, did you? But there's a special reason why I'm doing that right now. Because Venus is about the same size as the Earth, as you can see. It's about the same distance from the Sun. It ought to be a very similar sister planet in lots of ways. It's a little bit closer to the Sun, but not so as you'd notice. But this is what the Earth looks like, and this is what Venus looks like. Venus is actually a hellhole. Its surface is hot enough to melt lead. It rains with intense storms of sulfuric acid. Now, Venus is obviously called after the goddess of love, and love can be hell, believe me. But, catch up with me. But the reason there's that big difference between Venus and the Earth is just one tiny difference. It's not the size of it, it's not the distance from the Sun. It's that Venus has large quantities of greenhouse gases in its atmosphere. That's all. These gases that warm planets. And they've warmed Venus sufficiently that now the surface is all over 400 degrees C. Now that's a future that I'm imagining we don't particularly want for our planet, right? And that is a potential future for our planet if we continue with the greenhouse gases. Now, I've started talks about climate change along this way before. And one of the problems with it is it's dramatic, but it still tells the story that climate change is something in the far distant future, something to be worried about by tree huggers, right? So if you're a tree hugger, if you're an environmentalist, if you're a responsible investor, if you've got a soft heart, you should be worrying about climate change. Even worse, climate change is not just dealing with climate change, is not just the enemy of profit. The people who advocate it are actually anti-capitalists, right? This is my first ever protest march, my first ever demonstration. It was a couple of years ago in London. Can you see me? Come on. Anyone? You got Venus. Can you see me? I'll give you a clue. Ah. You can see the sunglasses. I put this in partly for the laugh, and partly because I wanted you to notice some of the placards that are up here. Can you see the one that says, "Capitalism creates climate chaos"? Now, there aren't any banners there from businesses, there aren't any banners there from banks, there aren't any banners there from the financial sector, but there are banners saying capitalism creates climate chaos. So this is a story, ladies and gentlemen, that we've all got trapped in. This is a story that says climate change is something for the far distant future, it's something for tree huggers and environmentalists and anti-capitalists, and it's not something for here and now. If we want to feel a bit guilty, maybe we could say, oh, you know, future generations, our children. Mark very memorably said that this morning. He said, we're stealing from our children and other people's children. We're actually doing worse than that. We're sort of stealing from ourselves because the real truth is it's not that capitalism creates climate chaos. It's that climate chaos is causing chaos to capitalism. It's exactly the other way around. And it's already happening. It's already here with us now. I'm going to tell you a very different story, and that's why I'm saying running with the new narratives, because there has been a seismic shift, even just in the last year and a half, in the world of business and particularly in the world of investment. And it was triggered in part by the events of Paris, but by many other things as well. And I'm just going to take you through the reasons I believe there's a whole new story to tell about the reasons we should actually be worrying about climate change right here and right now, as well as figuring out how we recreate the future. So this is Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England and, of course, Chairman of the Financial Stability Board. Now, he outlined specifically the ways in which he thinks climate change is already a threat to global financial stability? There are three principal ways that he raised. He said, direct physical risk to assets. Liability risk. With liability risk come risks like litigation, changes in regulation, and, of course, any of the other ways in which your reputation might be damaged by the effects of climate change. Risk from transition costs. This is the third one. This is, are you pouring your money, are you investing your money into something that is actually going to get stranded? So I'm going to take you through very quickly those three things and show you why I think there's been this seismic shift, and then show you what I think is actually happening about it. So first of all, direct physical risk. This gets a bit grim. I'm warning you. Because remember I said at the beginning, Venus shows a potential long-distant future. But what I'm going to show you now is the past and the present, the recent past and the present. And I'm going to show you what's actually been happening to our planet over the last few decades. And think about this in the context of climate change is already with us, it's already real. What impact might that be having on our investments and our assets? Okay, you ready? So this is showing a map of the world from the 1880s onwards, every decade. If it gets a bit bluer, it's gone a bit colder. If it gets a bit redder or yellower, it's gone a bit warmer. And you see, it gets warmer, it gets colder. It gets warmer, it gets colder. That's all perfectly natural. Till you get to the last few decades. It's not subtle. It's not subtle. It's absolutely incontrovertible. That's already really happening now, and that's before we even talk about what's the implications for the future. Because, you know what? We have this plan, there's this whole talk in Paris about setting a 2-degree temperature limit for how much we're going to let the planet warm. And that's because many scientists have figured out that 2 degrees is a dangerous level already. If we go beyond that, it's going to be much worse. I was talking to the head of the International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol, and he said to me, if the plan was to get to 6 degrees, year on year we couldn't be following it more faithfully. As if that was the business plan for the planet. Let's warm it up by 6 degrees. We're doing a brilliant job. We couldn't be following that more faithfully. This has consequences beyond just warming. Now, I don't have time here to talk to you about all of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, or 5 or 6 or 7 that climate change brings. I mentioned earlier that the Pentagon calls climate change a threat multiplier. That applies to things like the thing that I mentioned about migration and about people movement. But it also applies to all the different potential catastrophic weather events that can take place in the world. I'm focusing here on intense storms. What happens is you put more energy into the atmosphere, your storms get more intense. And we're already seeing that. So do you remember that whole slew of hurricanes that was rolling like great ball bearings along the Caribbean towards the end of last year? Do you remember that? This is one of them. This is Hurricane Irma. So I mentioned this because remember we're talking about direct asset risks, direct risks as a consequence of climate change that could happen right now. This is Hurricane Irma. It went over the island of Barbuda, and afterwards they said it was like someone had taken a lawnmower and just run it over the whole island. Nothing left standing. Nothing. This is what happened to Lower Manhattan when Superstorm Sandy struck. This is really stupid. Actually, the reason that the lights went off, and they stayed off for days, is that all the emergency generators, bar one, were actually in the basements and got flooded, and the electricity substations got flooded. Turn off Manhattan. I did a workshop there, and there was one guy from MasterCard who he was the chief of operations, and he came along. He's like, this isn't really relevant for me. It's not very important, but I kind of like to know what's happening in the world like you do today. And so he came along. I showed him this picture, and I talked about what happened in Manhattan then. And he went white. He said, I don't know if my suppliers of electricity have got any kind of plan in place for what happens if we get hit by a big storm. And for MasterCard, if the electricity goes off, we go off. You could say then, well, okay, we can get bad storms every now and then. Just look at this, though. In 2013, Typhoon Haiyan, it was the strongest tropical storm ever recorded in the Eastern Hemisphere. 2015, Hurricane Patricia, you may be starting to see a pattern here, the strongest tropical storm ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere. Cyclone Winston in Fiji, the strongest tropical storm ever recorded in the Southern Hemisphere, and so on. Now, I can do this for floods, I can do this for fires, I can do this for droughts, and I could also do this for food production. This is already with us, ladies and gentlemen. It's already here. And if we don't do something about it, it's going to get a whole lot worse. So that's the first one. And you might say, well, for any of those storms, how do you know that that one was particularly caused by climate change? And you probably can't. The science of attribution is getting better, but at the moment you probably can't. And that's why I've got this guy up here. You know who he is, right? Lance Armstrong. And he's holding up 7 fingers. The 7 times that he won the Tour de France. Now, I can ask you, which of those 7 times is because he was on steroids? First, second, third, I don't know. Definitely 5, possibly 2, 7. What we can say is the fact that he was on the steroids made all of them more likely every time he was taking them, right? What we're doing at the moment is we're putting our atmosphere on steroids. And all of those intense events, all of those catastrophic weather events are becoming more likely. So, cost of inaction, recognizing the value at risk from climate change, is an article that was in The Economist. $4.2 trillion at risk. So that's direct physical risk, liability risks. I'm going to speed along a bit now. Just show you one picture. You know who he is. Poor man, former CEO of Volkswagen. One little mistake. Nobody cares about this stuff. Nobody's going to check. Last time I looked, $30 billion they lost as a consequence of Dieselgate. And by the way, they've now come back. But the way that they've come back is by going into electric vehicles. Final one, risk from transition costs. Jeremy's going to say a lot more about this, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But just think about all of your investments, the companies that you're investing in. Are they investing in, are they looking at assets whose values are going to start running through their fingers? If you're investing in a coal-fired power plant now that has a 30-year lifespan, no energy company today seriously thinks that the energy system in 2030 or 2040 is going to look the way it does today. So, quick question for you. Given this, just pension funds. Think about fiduciary responsibility. What proportion of pension funds are actually considering climate risk in their investments right now? This is a study that was done by Mercer, and the answer was 5%. I'm going to run quickly through why I think that's happening. There are 4 different reasons that the United Nations Finance Initiative said about 10 years ago made it difficult for people to think about investing while considering climate risk. Lack of political and regulatory drivers was one. Lack of data was another. Lack of investment instruments was another. And my favorite, the need for a new narrative. Political and regulatory drivers. That's 196 political leaders that made an agreement unanimously to act on climate change. And I know Jeremy's going to talk a bit more about this as well. Lack of data. Here's an interesting one, Mike Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg was actually asked by Mark Carney to make a task force on climate-related financial disclosures. It's critical that industries and investors understand the risks posed by climate change. So he did. And in June last year, he announced the results. And the results were, every company should be reporting its climate-related risk at the same time as its financial results, alongside them. This isn't anymore a story that says, if you're soft-hearted or if you want to be green or if you've got responsible investors, you should worry about it. This is serious financial risk. When the report came out, companies with a combined market cap of more than 3.3 trillion were already saying, we're signing up to that, we're going to do that, we're going to report our climate risk. In December, it had gone up to 6.3 trillion. BlackRock wields its $6 trillion club to combat climate risk. These are not tree huggers, famously, right? Lack of data, lack of investment instruments. I don't have time to talk to you much about these, but I would like to raise them. About 2 years ago, I ran a workshop hosted by Ingvar Singstad, who is the head of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And at the time, there was somebody speaking at that who had these kind of wacky ideas about different investment vehicles that weren't divesting from one sector, but were taking out, staying with the whole spread of your portfolio, but taking out the 20% worst polluters from each of the sectors. Clever thing about this, it has a low tracking error. You've still got the same spread. You're not divesting just from one sector or another. if this takes off, if the whole climate thing takes off, they were saying 2-3 years ago, you can't really lose, you can only win. You break even, but you win. Because the companies that you're selectively not investing in are the ones that are going to suffer. And now UBS, also not famous tree huggers, and Legal in General have got funds doing that. BlackRock's looking into it as well. That's only 2 years later. It was a wacky idea 2 years ago. And now already those funds exist. So I'll give you the last one, the need for a new narrative. At that same workshop, Ingvar Stingstad, I don't know if you guys know him, but he is a numbers man. He's not soft-hearted at all. And I said, what do you need to be able to turn, to be able to invest with your pension fund, with your sovereign wealth fund, into companies that both have taken into consideration climate risk and are also building a future without climate change? And he said, our problem is we don't have the right story. We don't have the right story. So remember the tree-hugging story. That's the one we got trapped in. That's the one we're stuck in. Overwhelmingly, investors say to me, if only I could do it, I want to do the right thing, but unfortunately, we have a fiduciary duty. We have to make money for our shareholders. Can't afford to lose money. Someone else is going to have to do something. That story has gone. That ship has sailed. That is no longer true. Now, just very quickly, I want to show you one example of a changing narrative. Has anyone got one of these? Anyone else? Got 1, 2, 3? Okay. So you guys will know what the others maybe don't know, which is this car has a mode on the front of it called ludicrous mode on the dashboard. Ludicrous mode, do you know about this? When you see ludicrous mode, if you press it, a sign comes up that says, are you sure? And the options are, no, I want my mummy, or yes, bring it on. And if you press yes, bring it on, you get 0 to 60 miles an hour in 2.7 seconds. Now, do you remember when electric cars were boring and dull and worthy and self-righteous and only for tree huggers? Do you remember those? That story has changed. Now, whatever you think about Tesla, whatever you think about Teslas, this is an example of how dramatic a story change can be. And I want to finish up, actually, with just one quote from Peter Drucker. We had a quote from Peter Drucker with Mark earlier. He said, culture eats what? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Here's my version of a Peter Drucker quote. Every single social and global issue of our day is a business opportunity in disguise. I'll say that again. Every single social and global issue of our day is a business opportunity in disguise. Now, what's happened here is we know how to price risk. The danger, if you're investing, is investing in something where the risk is being ignored. So the first point is, do you know whether the assets in your portfolios, whether the companies in your portfolios are actually considering this? Do you know how much your money's at risk from climate change? And then the second part, which I know Jeremy is going to talk a lot more about, is are you taking the fullest opportunity, the fullest advantage of this great transition? Because that's the way to make money in the future. The disguise is coming off. Climate change is actually all about money now. How about that? Thank you.